Did you know that the Roman Empire, one of the greatest powers in history, owes much of its invincibility to a secret weapon? A mysterious, agile, and deadly force that decimated their enemies and dominated the battlefield. And this force wasn't the legions, but rather the Roman cavalry. Today, we're going to explore how these riders became the true pillars of Rome and the secret behind the power that made them unbeatable. What made Roman cavalry so formidable? How did they turn the tide in crucial battles, changing the fate of empires? Get ready, because the history of Roman cavalry is going to surprise you. Stay until the end to discover the impact of this secret weapon, which changed history forever. The wind howled over the hill, making the red cloaks of the Roman cavalry flutter like flags at dawn. Below, the battlefield stretched for miles, covered with spears shining in the sunlight. The Roman infantry was already in position, shields raised, waiting for the signal to advance. But Marcus Julius knew that, despite the legion's discipline, victory depended on something faster, fiercer. He gripped the reins of his horse, feeling the animal's energy vibrate beneath him. Around him, his men did the same. The cavalry was not just a support force. It was the decisive strike, the key to shattering the enemy's formation, the sentinels patrolling the empire's borders. While the infantry faced the direct clash of battle, the riders had the speed and agility to strike the enemy's weak points and chase them until no one was left standing. Marcus raised his sword high, and his voice echoed through the air. Horsemen of Rome, we are not just soldiers, we are the storm that will fall upon the enemy. The steel of our blades will be the last thing they see. The cavalry responded with war cries, banging spears against shields. Their steeds whinnied, eager to charge down the hill. This was not just another battle. It was the moment to show why Roman cavalry was feared across the world. Marcus Julius's horse snorted impatiently, sensing the tension in the air. The centurion looked around and saw his men ready, their eyes fixed on the enemy line below the hill. His heart raced, but his mind was steadfast. He knew that the cavalry was not just an elite troop. It was a tradition that had been in place since the early days of Rome, when the first kings understood the true value of horsemen. He recalled the stories told by the veterans around the campfire. In the beginning, the Roman cavalry was known as the Sellers, a select group of 300 riders chosen to protect the king. Unlike the infantry, the Sellers did not march. They flew across the battlefield, as fast as their name suggested. Over the years, their numbers grew, and under the reign of Servius Tullius, Rome boasted 1,800 horsemen. Marcus knew that he and his men were heirs to that tradition. They were not just warriors. They were part of a lineage of mounted fighters who shaped the fate of Rome. He took a deep breath and looked at his youngest subordinate, a young man with sharp eyes and firm hands on the reins. "Do you remember what makes us different from the legionaries, soldier?" Marcus asked. The young man nodded. "Speed, centurion. And impact." Marcus smiled. "Exactly. Now let's show them what that means." He turned to the rest of the squad and raised his sword. For the Senate and the people of Rome, the horsemen shouted in response. Then, with a single command, the hooves struck the ground, and the storm finally descended upon the enemy. The earth trembled beneath the horses' hooves as Marcus and his men charged forward. The wind cut across their faces, but the adrenaline drove them onward. The enemy infantry quickly closed in, spears raised, forming a wall of iron. But Marcus knew that his cavalry was no ordinary troop. They were Roman cavalry, members of the equestrian order, a distinct, respected, and feared class. Since ancient times, being a rider in Rome was not just a military position, but also a symbol of status. While most soldiers fought on foot, the equites rode to war in shining armor, with horses trained by the state itself. They not only received better equipment, but also political privileges, such as the right to vote and command important units. Marcus remembered the day his father handed him the golden ring, the symbol of the equestrian order. It was a tradition passed down from generation to generation. Growing up in that position meant discipline, exhaustive training, and the certainty that one day he would ride into battle, fighting not only for Rome, but for the prestige of his family. As the enemies drew closer, Marcus raised his sword and shouted, "Now, brothers, show them who we are." The horsemen broke through the enemy's spears, their swords cutting through the air. The force of the impact was brutal, the adversary's shields shattering under the overwhelming charge. It was not just physical power, it was the weight of history and tradition riding with them. The battlefield was chaos, but Marcus already knew the outcome. The Roman cavalry, heirs of the ancient equites, never retreated before the enemy. The dust raised by the clash of forces covered the battlefield like a golden cloak. The sound of swords clashing, spears breaking, and horses neighing filled the air. Marcus pulled the reins and spun his mount for another attack. His squadron, trained to act in unison, quickly reorganized, preparing for the next strike. For centuries, only the elite members of Rome could ride into battle, but that changed as Rome grew. Previously, only those who inherited wealth and land could afford a good horse and armor. However, as the years passed and wars increased, the need for more riders broke the exclusivity. Now, any citizen who could acquire a horse could join the cavalry. Marcus knew this reality well. Among his men, there were sons of senators, but also merchants who had become wealthy and earned a place in the ranks. While they fought alongside the equites, these new horsemen did not enjoy the same privileges. The prestige of a family name still carried weight within the army. He looked at one of his soldiers, a veteran named Titus, who came from a humble family. His skill with the spear was unquestionable, but Marcus knew that even fighting side by side, Titus would never have the same rights as him. The enemies began to retreat, breaking formation in the face of the cavalry's impact. Marcus saw the opportunity and raised his sword. Now, push forward. The horsemen charged after the fleeing enemies. It didn't matter where each soldier came from at that moment. In the heat of battle, it wasn't the family name that decided who would survive. It was the courage and the blade in their hands. The battlefield was filled with chaos. The enemies were retreating, but Marcus knew that victory would only be secured when the last resistance was crushed. He looked around, assessing his men. The Roman cavalry was formidable, but now they were not fighting alone. Among them were men from different lands, riding with the same determination. The auxiliaries, warriors recruited from conquered peoples, who had become the backbone of the Roman cavalry. Since the empire began to expand, it had become impossible to rely only on Roman citizens to make up the cavalry. Foreign peoples, such as the Gauls, Thracians, and Numidians, were known for their equestrian skills and were recruited in large numbers. Marcus remembered the first time he saw the Numidian riders in action. Without heavy armor, without saddles, only with small shields and spears, they moved like ghosts across the battlefield, striking and disappearing before the enemy could react. By his side, one of these auxiliaries rode, a Thracian warrior named Dares, with light armor and an ornate helmet. He wasn't Roman by birth, but he fought with the same ferocity. "They're trying to regroup up ahead," Dares shouted, pointing to a hill where the last enemies were attempting to set up a defense. Marcus nodded. The auxiliaries had learned from the Romans, but the Romans had also learned from them. Then we won't give them that chance. With a command, the cavalry charged once again. Numidians advanced along the flanks, cutting off escape routes, while Romans and Thracians attacked head-on. The enemy had no choice. They crumbled under the charge. Marco watched the scene, satisfied. Rome had changed. Its cavalry was no longer made up of just toga-wearing citizens with golden rings. Now, it was a force shaped by the diversity of the peoples the empire conquered. And that diversity was the key to its supremacy. The last enemy fell. Silence descended over the battlefield. Rome had triumphed once again. The dust began to settle over the field. Bodies lay scattered, while the last of the fleeing enemies were hunted down by the fastest riders. Marco pulled the reins, slowing his horse. Victory was certain, but he knew an army stayed strong through order and discipline. He raised his fist, signaling for his men to reorganize. Within moments, the formation was restored, as if the battle had never happened. That was the essence of Roman cavalry. Not just courage and strength, but also impeccable organization. Each squadron of cavalry, called a turma, consisted of 30 men, led by a decurio, an experienced commander chosen by the cavalry prefect. 16 turmi formed a wing, totaling 480 cavalrymen under the command of a prefect. Marco, as a centurion and member of the equestrian order, oversaw these divisions, ensuring every cavalryman knew his role on the battlefield. He rode over to one of the decurions, a veteran named Faustus, who was already sharpening his blade in preparation for any new combat. "Gather the men. I need a report on casualties and the condition of the horses." Faustus nodded and immediately began calling the decurions. Within minutes, each squadron was in position, ready for further orders. Marco took a deep breath. The battle had been intense, but the war wasn't won yet. The organization of the cavalry was what kept them alive. Without it, They'd be just a band of wild warriors amidst chaos. He looked at the horizon, where the dust from the enemy forces had disappeared. He knew that soon, another fight would come. And when that moment arrived, his cavalry would be ready to strike with the same precision as always. Rome marches in order. And where there is order, there is victory. The cavalrymen shouted in response, banging their lances against their shields. They were ready for whatever came next. The sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of gold and scarlet. Marco watched as his men dismounted, tending to the wounded and checking their equipment. The battle had been tough, but once again, his cavalry had proven its worth. Still, he knew that every confrontation required more than just strength and speed. Versatility was the key to victory. That's why Rome didn't rely solely on the traditional aili of 480 cavalrymen. In certain campaigns, special units were designated to face specific challenges. One of them was the feared ala miliaria, composed of 720 cavalrymen, a larger, more powerful shock force, trained for devastating attacks against enemy formations. Marco had seen this unit in action more than once. Unlike regular cavalry, the men of the ala miliaria were selected from the best, often veterans hardened by years of battle. Their main advantage was their number. While an enemy might expect to face a conventional force, the ala miliaria would appear like a storm, overwhelming any resistance. But Rome didn't rely solely on pure cavalry. Some legions used the cohors sectata, a hybrid troop that combined infantry and cavalry in the same unit. This model allowed flexibility on the battlefield. When cavalry needed to dismount and fight on foot, soldiers trained for both roles could spring into action without losing efficiency. Marco dismounted and walked over to Dares, the Thracian auxiliary who had fought bravely that day. The man wiped the sweat from his brow and checked the reins of his horse. "Have you ever served with the ala miliaria?" Marco asked. Dares smiled crookedly. "Once in the east. They attack like a wave. When you see them, it's already too late." Marco nodded. He knew that war wasn't just about strength, but about strategy. Sometimes, a crushing force like the ala miliaria was necessary. Other times, the mobility of the cohors sectata made all the difference. The centurion looked around. His men were exhausted, but alive. Thanks to Rome's impeccable organization, they were ready for the next fight, no matter when or where. Rest, but be ready. The enemy is not finished yet. And neither are we. The cavalrymen nodded confidently. The war continued, but Rome would always find a way to prevail. Dawn brought with it an unsettling silence. Marco knew the enemy had not been completely defeated. Reports from scouts confirmed what he had already suspected. The barbarians were gathering forces for another attack. This time, victory would depend not only on brute force, but on the right strategy. He gathered his decuriones and auxiliaries around an improvised map, drawn on the ground with the tip of a dagger. The enemy will try to encircle us. They know the terrain better than we do. But that doesn't matter. We have order. We have discipline. And we know how to fight. The cavalryman nodded. The Roman infantry was the soul of the army, but the cavalry were its eyes and sharp claws. Their position on the battlefield was never random. They protected the flanks of the legion, preventing the enemy from attacking the vulnerable sides of the formation. If the front line held firm, the cavalry would deliver the final blow. Marco traced a semicircle in the dirt. "We'll divide our forces. The first terma will hold the flanks of the infantry. The second will lie in wait. When the barbarians think they have us pressured, you'll break through their rear." Dares, the Thracian auxiliary, nodded with a confident grin. "And when they run, we'll hunt them down." "Exactly. We won't just beat them. We'll crush any chance of escape." When the sun reached its peak, the first war cries echoed through the valley. The enemy forces advanced, believing they had the upper hand. But Marco already knew the outcome. Roman cavalry was more than just strength. It was precision. It was strategy. "Wait for the signal," Marco shouted. The initial impact came against the infantry, which held the line firmly. The barbarians charged with ferocity, but the legion kept its formation intact, their shields clashing like impenetrable walls. Marco kept his cavalry in place. It wasn't time yet. Then he saw it. The barbarians were advancing too far, exposing their backs. Now, like thunder splitting the sky, the cavalry surged. The first barbarians realized too late. Their ranks were already pierced by spears. Chaos took over. What had been a fierce offensive turned into a desperate rout. Marco and his men pressed relentlessly, cutting off any chance of regrouping. When the dust settled, the enemy army was destroyed. Rome hadn't won just because it had stronger soldiers. It had won because it knew how to use them. Marco took a deep breath, watching the last of the fallen barbarians. Right position, right moment, and an army that knows how to use them. That's why Rome never falls. The battle was won, but Marco knew the war never truly ended. That was just one more clash among many that would come. And if Rome wanted to keep dominating, its soldiers had to be ready for any challenge. While the cavalrymen tended to the wounded and checked their gear, Marco turned his attention to the recruits. Some young men, freshly incorporated into the cavalry, had fought for the first time. He noticed the exhaustion on their faces and the uncertainty in their eyes. Today's victory had been won with the blood of veterans, but the future of the cavalry depended on the new generation. He walked over to one of the recruits, a young man named Aulus, who was still holding his spear with trembling hands. "How do you feel?" Marco asked. The young man hesitated before answering. "Tired and lucky to be alive, but I didn't fight the way I should have. My horse hesitated, and so did I." Marco nodded. He had seen this before. Everyone thought they were ready for war until they were actually in it. You don't have the training yet, but that's going to change. The training of the Roman cavalry was a trial that separated men from boys. For 4 months, recruits underwent intensive exercises, starting with horsemanship. Before even holding a weapon, they had to learn to control their horses perfectly. Your horse hesitated because you hesitated. A rider and his steed must be one in the battlefield. You will learn this, and much more. Aulus swallowed hard. The training included forced marches, where the cavalry rode long distances carrying extra weight to simulate battle conditions. Then came dismounted combat drills. If a rider fell in the midst of battle, he needed to continue fighting like an infantryman. The recruits also learned how to build camps, set up defenses, and survive without supplies for days. The Roman cavalry was not only fast, it was resilient. Marco slapped Aulus on the shoulder. "You survived your first combat. Now comes the hard part, learning never to hesitate again." The young man nodded. He was tired, but also determined. Marco smiled. He knew that in a few months, those uncertain eyes would give way to the sharp gaze of a true Roman knight. And when that day came, no enemy would stand a chance. Night fell quietly over the Roman camp, but the work was far from over. The battlefield was a place of chaos and destruction, and Rome knew that preparation before combat could make the difference between life and death. Marco walked among the cavalrymen, observing the meticulous preparation of each one. The recruits were now accustomed to the intense pace of preparations. They checked their spears, sharpened their swords, and inspected the harnesses of their horses, with a concentration that reflected the seriousness of their mission. Marco passed by a group of veterans practicing javelin throws. Each of them already knew the necessary movements, but even the most experienced repeated the drills as if it were their first day of training. He stopped beside Fausto, the decurion, who was overseeing the movements. Fausto was watching his men with a sharp eye, making sure that all the cavalrymen were ready for what was to come. Tomorrow's battle will be tough. The barbarians won't give us any respite. Fausto looked at Marco and nodded, his expression as hard as always. That's why we're preparing as if it were our last fight. Every move, every throw must be perfect. Do you understand me, Centurion? Marco knew exactly what Fausto was talking about. The preparation of each cavalryman was not only to hone their skills, but to ensure they would react instinctively in combat. When swords clashed and spears flew, there would be no time to think. What they practiced now, in the quiet hours before the battle, was what would save their lives. Some cavalrymen were practicing quick retreats, an essential technique in case of an ambush. Others, like Aulus, were focused on perfecting their spear throwing, something crucial for breaking enemy lines before a direct charge. And there were those practicing evasion and surprise attacks, leaping from the shadows swiftly, as if part of the night itself. Marco observed every detail, like a master who knows the limits of his students. The battle won't just be brute force. It will be intelligence. Every throw, every maneuver must be executed with precision. He looked at the cavalryman with a subtle smile. When the enemy approaches, don't hesitate. Attack with everything you've got. Our strength isn't just in numbers, but in our ability to work as one body. Each of you is an essential part of this army. Spearfighting lessons, pursuit strategies, and real-world scenario simulations were the final stages of training. Marco knew that the outcome of the battle wouldn't be decided by a single cavalryman, but by the entire formation he helped maintain. When the moment came, they needed to be more than simple warriors. They needed to be a war machine, synchronized and unbeatable. Let's move out to the field. What we learned here will make the difference between victory and defeat. Let's make Rome proud. The cavalrymen stomped their feet on the ground, like one wave, ready for what was to come. The battlefield awaited, but now, more than ever, they were prepared to face it. The sun had barely risen on the horizon, but the activity on the field was already in full swing. The air was thick with the scent of dust and spears. The sound of hooves striking the ground echoed throughout the camp. It was a different day. This would be the day when the new recruits would officially be accepted into the Roman cavalry. They had already faced a battle, but now, after the rigorous training and simulations, they needed to take the final step to become true Roman knights. Marco walked with firm steps among the cavalrymen, observing the young men who had joined the legion in recent months. Their eyes were full of anxiety, but also of silent determination. Their moment was coming. At that moment, the atmosphere in the camp was filled with solemnity. All the recruits gathered in a circle, with their horses beside them. A tall and robust veteran soldier approached Marco, carrying a set of ancient scrolls. He was the officer responsible for the oath ceremony, a rite marking the new knight's official entry into the equestrian order. Marco stopped before the group of recruits and raised his hand, calling for silence. When everyone fell silent, he spoke in a deep voice filled with authority. "You have undergone immense training, faced challenges, and proven yourselves worthy of being part of this unit. Today, all of you become Roman knights, sons of eternal Rome. But for this to happen, more than just skill and courage is needed. It requires honor, loyalty, and an unbreakable oath." He paused and looked directly at Aulus, the young man he knew was the most anxious of them all. Marco felt the boy was ready, but the ceremony required something more, a total dedication to Rome and her people. "Repeat after me, and may your hearts become as firm as steel." The silence stretched for a few seconds before the recruits began to repeat Marco's words in unison. "I swear loyalty to Rome, to the Senate, and to the Roman people. I swear to protect the city with my life, serve Rome with courage, and fight until my last breath to uphold the honor of our great civilization." Marco looked at them with approval, but his expression remained serious. The oath was the deepest commitment a knight could make. It was more than a formality. It was a promise that they would be willing to sacrifice everything, even their own lives, for the greatness of Rome. After the oath, the officer approached with the military diploma, a scroll marking the official acceptance of the new knight. Each recruit received his, with a signature from the Senate and the emperor himself. The diploma represented more than just recognition. It was the guarantee of privileges, of elevated status within Roman society, and the promise that they would be respected as members of the noble equestrian order. Aulus, with his sweaty forehead and eyes shining with emotion, received his diploma with trembling hands. Marco watched him, remembering his own oath many years ago. "Now you are a Roman knight, Aulus. And with this title comes great responsibility. Never forget the honor you carry with you." The young knight looked at Marco and nodded, his heart pounding harder than ever. He had achieved what many men spent their entire lives trying to attain. But as Marco knew well, this achievement was only the beginning of a journey that required courage and sacrifice. Marco looked to the horizon, where the distant hills were already beginning to glow with the first rays of sunlight. "Now, knights, we are ready for whatever comes. May Rome always be our guide." The collective shout of the cavalry rang across the field, powerful and vibrant, echoing like a promise that would be kept. They were ready to fight, ready to defend Rome, and show the world the indomitable power of the Roman cavalry. The camp was in full swing, with the cavalrymen adjusting their saddles and preparing their horses for what was to come. However, for Marco, the day would begin differently. Today, he would receive a special visit from a master, someone whose knowledge of horses was renowned throughout the Hellenistic world. He was an experienced Greek trainer from the eastern coasts of the empire, a man with graying hair and deep-set eyes, known among the Romans as Herodotus. He was not only an expert in horsemanship, but also a scholar of the ancient riding techniques developed by the Greeks, methods that Rome was still attempting to adapt for its own military purposes. Herodotus was respected among the Romans, but his ideas were not always well understood. Many soldiers and commanders found his approaches to be gentler and less aggressive than the direct combat style that Rome held dear. However, Marco knew that a cavalryman couldn't rely solely on brute strength. To be effective, it was necessary to understand the art of controlling the animal, of making the horse an extension of the rider's body. The Greek observed the cavalryman practicing in the field with a keen eye as Marco approached. "Master Herodotus," Marco said, greeting the man with a bow. The Greek gave a slight nod, smiling with a certain pride. "Centurion Marco, I see the discipline of your cavalry is admirable, but allow me to observe. True skill comes from harmony between the horse and the rider. It's not just about strength, it's about precision, control." Marco nodded, already knowing what he meant. Control over the horse was crucial. For years, Rome had employed simple methods based on physical training and the natural qualities of the animals. However, the Greek tradition had a more refined, intellectual approach compared to Roman brutality. Herodotus believed that if Rome wanted to improve its mounted combat skills, it would need to look at how the Greeks handled their horses, with more patience, technique, and above all, respect. Herodotus signaled for Marco to approach one of the horses. Observe the horse's posture. The horse needs to feel safe, trust its rider. If there's tension, the horse will respond with resistance. The rider must become part of the animal, not treated as a mere vehicle of war. He gently pulled the reins, and the horse, which had been impatient at first, began to relax. Marco watched closely. The way the Greek touched the horse, how he guided its body, was light, almost imperceptible. Herodotus was doing more than controlling the horse. He was guiding it as part of himself. "I understand," Marco said, touching the horse's neck with the same gentleness. "It's about establishing a bond, not just dominating." Herodotus smiled, satisfied. "Exactly. And this bond can be the key to the speed and agility required on the battlefield. When you and your horse completely understand each other, you can anticipate each other's movements. In combat, this can mean the difference between a precise strike and a fatal mistake." Marco felt there was something more, something he hadn't considered before. His cavalrymen were well trained, but the methods they used seemed more focused on strength than on subtlety. He began to see the value in the Greek approach. The horse wasn't just a weapon, but a living creature that required more than a rider's command. It needed mutual trust. Throughout the morning, Herodotus taught more refined techniques. The way to adjust the reins gently, how to apply minimal pressure on the horse's legs to make it move more fluidly, how to establish a steady rhythm even during the fiercest of charges. Aulus, the young cavalryman, watched closely, curious about the new method. Beside Marco, he was beginning to understand what was happening. Rome was evolving, and the Roman cavalrymen needed to realize that war wasn't won by strength alone, but by technique and synchronization. "Are you understanding, Aulus?" Marco asked, watching the young man as he absorbed Herodotus's lessons. Aulus looked at him with a subtle smile. "Yes, Centurion. It's clearer now. It's not just about how to ride or fight, but how to trust both the horse and the rider." Marco gave a slight smile and looked toward the horizon, where the hills seemed to recede, offering a broader view of the future. The Roman Empire was constantly expanding, but now, its cavalry was evolving too. Not just to fight better, but to understand the balance between man and animal, between strength and technique. Herodotus approached Marco, a gleam in his eyes. "Rome has great potential, Centurion, and this new generation of cavalrymen will be even more formidable if they know how to balance strength with the art of horsemanship. The future of the Roman cavalry will be glorious." Marco nodded in gratitude. He knew that this lesson would not be forgotten, and that Rome would become more powerful and precise, not just because of strength, but through wisdom and how to use its resources. The future, indeed, seemed more promising than ever. The field was constantly moving, but there was something new in the air. The camp, usually focused on training the cavalrymen, was now dedicating specific time to what Marco knew was the true backbone of the cavalry, the warhorse. Over the past few months, he had witnessed the growing effort to improve the relationship between the cavalrymen and their horses. Now, with Herodotus' teachings on horsemanship, the next phase of training had begun, teaching the animals to withstand the pressure of the battlefield, to be immune to the chaos, the sound of swords and spears, the battle cries, and even the roars of exotic animals that enemies might use to terrorize them. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in orange and gold. Marco stood watching the cavalry in action, but his focus was on the animals. He walked alongside his own horse, a large and imposing animal that had been meticulously prepared for the demands of battle. It was a strong warhorse, but agile, bred to carry the weight of armor, withstand the pressure of battle, and act according to its rider's will. Aulus, now an experienced cavalryman, was mounted on his horse, both going through a series of tests involving endurance and agility. They needed to be ready to march long distances without rest, cross difficult terrain without hesitation, and most challenging of all, stay calm even when the sounds of battle approached. The horse, just like the rider, needed discipline and control. Marco watched closely the training involving the horses. There were young horses being conditioned to march for hours without distraction, some being led by small troops simulating a battle charge. There was also the exercise with sound, trumpets playing in the distance, the war cries of the men, even the booming of large drums, all designed to test the animals' reactions. The fear that many horses felt at the sound of battle was one of the greatest obstacles Rome faced. Herodotus had been right when he said that it wasn't enough to master the horse. The animal also needed to be trained to handle the chaos of war. In one corner of the field, a group of cavalrymen was guiding their horses through a series of makeshift obstacles, including fences and fallen logs, designed to mimic rough terrain that might be encountered in a real battle. Each horse, with its rider, had to show agility, confidence, and the ability to make quick decisions. Marco approached one of the groups, seeing Faustus in action, guiding his mount masterfully through the obstacles as his horse jumped nimbly without hesitation. "This is more than physical training, Faustus," Marco said, observing. "The horses need to learn to trust their riders in every movement, as if they were an extension of their bodies." Fausto smiled and nodded. "You're right, Marco, but it's more than that. They need to learn to stay steady, even when the ground feels like it's falling apart. A horse in battle must be as invincible as its rider. They can't falter in the face of fear or pressure. And if they're well trained, they can even overcome obstacles we never imagined." The sound of drums echoed in the distance, and Marco turned to see a group of warriors with improvised weapons simulating the approach of an enemy army. It was one of the toughest tests, as the goal was to make the horses resist a sudden attack, with the shouting, clanging metal, and chaotic movements of men trying to get close quickly. The horses, as if they knew something was coming, began to stir, but the riders remained steady, guiding them skillfully. Marco watched with a certain pride the way his riders reacted. They were more confident, more in sync with their animals. The hard work was paying off. Every rider, every horse, was beginning to master the skills that would make them invincible. When the enemy arrives, it won't just be the strength of the lances or the weight of the armor that will decide the battle. It will be the control the riders have over their horses. If the bond between man and beast is perfect, the enemy army won't stand a chance. Aulus, now fully integrated into the training, seemed more comfortable and confident with his mount. He had a new respect for his horse, and with it, a new strength. "We're ready, Marco," Aulus said after an impressive maneuver. "My men and I, and our horses, were ready." Marco smiled with a mix of pride and confidence, but he knew there was still more to be done. Training never ended, especially when it came to preparing soldiers and horses for what lay ahead. "Yes, Aulus, we're more than ready," Marco replied. "Now, it's time to show the world what we're made of." The future was near, and Rome was preparing to face new challenges. But with riders like Aulus and his companions, and horses trained with such care and dedication, Marco felt that victory was already within reach. In the days that followed the intense training, Marco began to realize that beyond physical strength and technique, the care for the horses was one of the most crucial aspects of Rome's success. The animals were not merely machines of war. They were living beings with their own needs and limitations, which, if not addressed, could compromise the entire effectiveness of the army. And so, the lessons Marco had learned about the riders had to be extended to the daily care of the horses themselves. It was a cold morning when Marco woke up before the sun, the first rays of light illuminating the camp's tents. In the distance, he could hear the soft sound of horses being fed and grooms preparing them for the day. He decided to walk to the stables to personally check how his horses were being cared for. He knew that Rome depended as much on the endurance of its soldiers as it did on its animals, and any neglect could mean disaster. As he entered the stable, the familiar smell of straw and wet wood greeted him. This was a vital place for the safety of the empire. Marco carefully watched the men and women who took care of the horses, feeding them fresh hay, combing their manes, and adjusting their saddles. The work was hard but absolutely necessary. Aulus was there too, caring for his own horse. Marco saw him gently stroke the animal's neck with a peaceful expression, showing a genuine affection for his battle companion. "Good job, Aulus," Marco said, approaching him. "The horses are our greatest allies. No matter how strong the rider is, if the horse isn't well, the fight will be impossible." Aulus looked up and smiled. "Yes, Marco. I've learned that taking care of the horse is just as important as training the mount. They need to be well-fed, well-rested, and free from any injuries that could affect them on the battlefield." Marco watched more closely the care given to the animals. One of the riders was applying a special ointment to the legs of a horse that had shown signs of fatigue after the last training session. Others were carefully cleaning the hooves, while others were still assessing the general health of each horse. Marco knew that every detail mattered. Care for the legs, the hooves, proper feeding, even the gentle massages that helped relieve the animal's muscle tension. Preventive care is key, Marco said while observing the activity. Wounds can be treated, but it's better to prevent them from happening. And that starts with proper nutrition and constant monitoring of the horse's health. They need to be strong, fast, and ready for any challenge. Aulus nodded, his focus now on the horse, which softly whinnied as it sensed the presence of its rider. "I've noticed that, Marco. During training, we saw that if a horse has untreated wounds, its speed and endurance are reduced. And if they aren't properly fed, the animals won't have enough energy to endure the rigors of a long battle." Marco smiled, pleased with Aulus's understanding. He knew that discipline shouldn't just be limited to the physical training of the riders, but also to the daily care of the horses. After all, the success of a battle didn't depend solely on fighting skills, but on complete preparation, which involved both men and animals. And mental health is just as important as physical health. Marco continued while looking at the other riders taking care of their own horses. The animals need to be calm, not stressed. Fear or anxiety can affect their performance in combat. Herodotus, the Greek master who had stayed behind to continue his teachings, approached Marco. "Marco is right. And there's another important aspect that many neglect: posture. The horse needs to learn to relax and trust its rider, without worrying about what's going on around it. That's why training is not just physical, but also psychological. The horse must understand that its rider is its leader, not just a mere driver." Marco reflected on Herodotus's words. It was true that Rome was at a turning point, where physical training was no longer enough. There was a need for a more holistic approach, where the bond between rider and horse became a determining factor. The riders were beginning to realize that they couldn't treat their horses as war machines. They needed to be cared for, respected, and understood. "It's a relationship of trust, Marco," Aulus said now with a deeper understanding. "This will make all the difference in battle. When a rider and their horse trust each other, they can overcome any obstacle." The morning passed quickly, but Marco felt that another lesson had been learned. He knew that in the days to come, Rome's horses would be more prepared than ever, not just physically, but mentally. With the care and attention given to each of them, the Roman Empire could expect its horses, so crucial in battles, to be ready for any challenge. As the sun set, casting a golden hue over the camp, Marco felt a renewed confidence. Rome was stronger than ever, and its horses, now treated with the same dedication and respect as its riders, were symbols of that strength. "Now we can truly fight as a unit," Marco said to himself. "Together, rider and horse, Rome will be unbeatable." With the camp finally prepared and the horses in excellent condition, Marco knew that the real battle was about to begin. The army was in full training, but there was still one crucial thing to perfect: the control equipment. Every rider knew that, to fight effectively, they had to be able to fully master their mounts, and that wouldn't be possible without the proper use of the equipment. Marco had studied the subject extensively. He knew that, to ensure a horse's obedience in combat, the communication between rider and animal couldn't rely solely on words or gestures. Something more was needed: absolute control over the horse's movements, through reins, spurs, and of course the saddles. These instruments were more than simple accessories. They were extensions of the rider's hands, tools that could mean the difference between life and death on the battlefield. The morning was hot, and the knights were gathered in a large area of the camp where they could demonstrate their training. Marco watched attentively as Aulus, with his carefully prepared horse, got ready to perform a complex exercise. "Today, we'll focus on precise control of the horse," Marco announced. "Every movement must be calculated, whether it's to avoid an obstacle, attack an enemy, or reposition quickly." The knights were ready, but for Marco, The most important thing was seeing how they used their reins, spurs, and even the saddle efficiently. He knew that control over the horse began the moment the rider mounted. The rider and the horse needed to work in perfect harmony. The rigid bits were one of the key items to ensure complete mastery of the horse. Marco knew that when properly adjusted, the bits allowed for an immediate response from the horse to commands, whether to stop, accelerate, or change direction. These bits were much more than simple pieces of metal. They were tools designed to ensure that the rider could control the horse without causing pain or discomfort to the animal. They reflected the relationship of respect between rider and mount, and Marco firmly believed in this principle. Additionally, the Roman saddle had unique features. The front and rear horns were not just ornamental, as they might appear at first glance. They were meant to ensure that the rider remained stable even on uneven ground or during quick maneuvers. Every rider who mounted the saddle felt this security, and the stability provided by the horns helped prevent unnecessary falls during intense battles. "Remember, knights," Marco said, approaching a group. "The reins are your communication tools. Every pull, every touch must be precise. If you feel your horse isn't responding correctly, it's your responsibility to correct it immediately, without excessive force. Control is a dance, and you must be the masters of this dance." Aulus, now adjusting his horse for the exercise, made a careful movement with the reins. He gently pulled to the right, guiding the mount to avoid a log placed on the field as an obstacle. The horse, well trained and in good spirits, responded swiftly, following the direction of the reins. Marco watched closely. Aulus wasn't just controlling the animal with force. He was using the reins strategically, making the horse follow his commands with precision. "That's it, Aulus," Marco exclaimed, pleased. "Every command of yours was clear and direct." The horse responded without hesitation. Next, Marco turned to the other knights and began observing how each of them used their spurs. He knew that spurs were powerful tools, but had to be used wisely. They weren't meant to cause pain, but to give a subtle command, a pressure at the exact moment. The knights who used spurs correctly were the ones who became true masters of horsemanship. Spurs should not be used as punishment, knights. They're just a touch, a reminder. If the horse isn't responding as it should, a light pressure from the spurs will guide it without harming it. Remember, control doesn't come from punishment, but from trust. The maneuvers began to intensify. Each knight, gently touching the reins or lightly pressing the spurs, was creating an almost telepathic connection with their horse. The exercise, now more challenging, involved the rider and the animal performing tight turns, rapid direction changes, and even simulated attacks. Every movement required precision, and Marco knew that the true skill of the knights was shown in their control. At the end of the exercise, sweat glistened on the foreheads of both the knights and their horses, but everyone seemed satisfied with their performance. Marco stood next to Aulus, watching the group with a proud smile. "I'm impressed by all of you," Marco said, his eyes gleaming. "The precision with which each of you controlled your horses today was impressive. We're ready for anything the Empire needs." Aulus, still mounted on his horse, looked at Marco with respect. "It's a true partnership, Marco. It's not just about being a good rider, it's about understanding the animal. Every detail, from the saddle to the use of the spurs, is part of this communication." Marco nodded, feeling a great pride as he saw how his knights were becoming not just soldiers, but masters of their animals. Control was no longer just a matter of strength, but of connection, and this connection was what made Rome so powerful. He knew that, when facing the enemy, the ability to dominate the battlefield would depend on how well his knights and horses worked together. And at that moment, Marco felt that they were ready to conquer the world. After the control exercise, Marco and the other knights gathered for a brief rest. The heat of the day was beginning to take its toll, and everyone was sweaty but satisfied with the progress made. However, Marco knew that, to truly be prepared for any battle, something was still missing: the knight's armor. In ancient Rome, armor was not just about protection, but also about identity and status. For the knights, their armor needed to be more than just a shield against the enemy's blade. It needed to be an extension of their power, reflecting the vital role they played in battles. Marco knew that armor wasn't just made to withstand blows. It had to be designed to ensure flexibility and agility, allowing the rider to move with speed and dexterity, essential for high-speed combat. At the same time, protection couldn't be neglected, as the fight would be relentless, and every blow against the rider could be fatal. That afternoon, Marco gathered his knights for a demonstration. They were ready to put on their armor and test its durability and mobility. Marco once again felt responsible for ensuring that every knight understood the value of their armor and how to use it correctly. "Today, we're going to train with our armor," Marco said, facing the knights. "It's vital that we know how to move, fight, and ride with it, because heavy armor can be a great obstacle if not properly fitted." Each knight began to dress. Marco, observing, realized that the Roman cavalry armor was designed with meticulous attention to detail. It was made of chainmail or scales, providing good protection without compromising mobility too much. The chainmail consisted of interwoven iron rings, offering effective defense against blades, while the scales, made of metal or bronze, were lighter and at the same time more durable, covering critical areas of the body. "The secret of Roman armor is balance, knights," Marco continued, watching Aulus put on his own armor. "It must cover the body well, but also allow you to move your arms and legs freely." Aulus, now fully armored, adjusted his shield. He was already used to the weight, but he felt that, with each training, the armor was becoming more like a second skin. He no longer saw the armor as something heavy, but as a necessary protection, an ally for the battle. Marco approached him, touching the chainmail and observing the details. "Your armor should be like your very soul, Aulus. An extension of who you are as warriors," Marco said firmly, but with respect. "Every piece of chainmail, every metal part, is designed not only to protect, but to show your rank. You are Roman knights, and that is reflected in everything, even in how you dress for battle." Aulus nodded, understanding the depth of what Marco meant. Rome had always known how to value appearance, and the armor was a reflection of that culture. But it was also a vital defense, a barrier between life and death. Marco knew that the sense of security provided by good armor could be a determining factor in battle. Looking at the other knights, Marco noticed that they were all equally confident in their armor. They were ready, but there was something else he wanted to highlight. "Don't forget, knights," he said, raising his voice so everyone could hear. "The armor is vital, but the confidence in wearing it is even more important. When you're on the battlefield, it should be an extension of your courage. If you hesitate, the enemy will notice. So give it your all. The weight doesn't matter. The noise doesn't matter. Focus only on the mission ahead." The knights, now more motivated than ever, mounted their horses and lined up for an attack and defense exercise. The clang of metal against metal echoed across the field as Marco observed closely. Each knight moved with more confidence, adapting to the weight of their armor with increasing ease, knowing it offered vital protection against any strike. "Now, knights, let's practice the attack," Marco commanded. "Remember, the armor should be an ally, not a burden. Use it to your advantage." The knights galloped at speed, each attacking the targets placed strategically along the field. The impact of the lances against the shields and the resilience of the armor were put to the test. Marco noticed how the flexibility of the scales and the sturdiness of the chainmail allowed for fast movements, which were essential for the success of any knight. As the exercise progressed, Marco saw what he wanted. The knights were becoming more than just soldiers. They were becoming a unified fighting force, with every piece of their armor and every combat move working in perfect harmony. "Excellent, knights," Marco said proudly. "Now you understand the true value of your armor. It's not just to protect, but to unleash the warrior within you. Now, let's keep honing those skills." By the end of the afternoon, the sun was setting, and the knights were exhausted but satisfied. Marco felt that, finally, the transformation was complete. His knights were ready to face any adversary, not just because of their combat skills, but because of their confidence in themselves and in the power of their armor. Rome was, once again, stronger than ever. Marco approached the center of the field, where the knights, now without their horses, were removing their armor. With every movement, he saw the dedication written on their faces. They were tired, yes, but they knew they were more prepared than ever. But there was one last thing to reinforce. The final important piece of the puzzle was the helmet. Marco knew that, while armor and weapons were essential for combat, the helmet provided a layer of protection that could be the difference between life and death. With a gesture, Marco called Aulus and the other knights to a meeting, where he explained what the next step in training would be. He was eager to see how they would react to the new challenge. "Knights, today we will focus on a vital piece for our safety in battle. The helmet," Marco began, his voice firm, yet serious. "Head protection is crucial. On the battlefield, a well-aimed blow to the skull can change the outcome of a whole fight. The knights, always attentive to their commander's words, began to put on their helmets. These pieces, made of metal, were designed to protect not only the top of the head, but also the more vulnerable areas, such as the neck and ears. The helmets of the Roman knights were more robust than those used by infantry, as they had to withstand the impact of enemy weapons while providing better visibility and comfort for the warrior. The helmet, also known as a galea, was often more ornate than those worn by other soldiers. Marco knew that the function of protecting the head was paramount, but the helmet's design, with its elegant lines and decorative details, also reflected the social importance of the Roman knight. The knights were a distinguished class, and that needed to be visible in everything they wore. Aulus, already adjusting his helmet, looked at Marco, eager for further instructions. Knights, what many don't know, Marco continued, is that the helmet is not only a physical protection, but also a symbol of status. It shows that you are members of a privileged class, and that as knights, you have a higher mission than just fighting. You must inspire respect and confidence among allies and fear in enemies. As Marco spoke, he observed the group of knights carefully, analyzing every detail. He noticed how some adjusted their helmets naturally, while others seemed a bit uncomfortable, as if they hadn't yet gotten used to the extra weight. But remember, knights, Marco went on, it's not just about appearance. The helmet must be worn properly to ensure maximum protection. The most important part is the protection of the ears and the top of the head. This design was made to ensure that, even in fierce combat, you can still hear the sounds around you while remaining well protected. Marco then approached Aulus, who was practicing quick movements with his neck, adjusting his helmet with the skill of someone already accustomed to wearing it. "How does it feel, Aulus?" Marco asked, with an inquisitive tone, as he watched the knight move. Aulus performed a series of combat movements, spinning his body and tilting his head to simulate a battle. "I'm adapting well, Marco. But really, the extra protection on the ears makes a big difference. I can hear the sounds around me better, which gives me more confidence on the battlefield." Marco nodded, satisfied with the response. Hearing protection was crucial, as it allowed the knight to identify imminent dangers, such as the sound of enemy horses approaching or commands from the commander during battle. "Exactly, Aulus," Marco replied. "That's one of the reasons why the galea is essential. It not only offers resistance to strikes, but also improves the ability to hear and react quickly. Now, everyone, let's test our combat skills with the helmets. We need to get used to them, as soon we'll be wearing this protection in real battles." The knights were ready. They mounted their horses again, now with their helmets firmly adjusted. The sound of armor and hooves pounding against the ground echoed across the field as they lined up for a simulated combat exercise. Marco, watching closely, gave the order to begin. The training field quickly turned into a mock battle scenario, with knights attacking each other, dodging, and making quick moves, all with the added weight of the helmets. Marco was attentive, analyzing how each knight performed, evaluating whether the helmet was hindering or contributing to his men's performance. Aulus, once again, stood out. He seemed to move with the same speed as before, without hesitation, despite the helmet. Marco was impressed to see how the knights were beginning to integrate the protection into their combat style. "Well done, knights," Marco said after the exercise. "Now that everyone is more familiar with the helmet, we can say that we are more prepared than ever. The head must be protected, but the mind must stay alert. Let's use this protection to our advantage." The knights were visibly more confident now, and Marco knew that each of them had internalized the value of the helmet. It wasn't just for protection, but an essential part of their identity on the battlefield. They were ready for whatever came next. Dawn brought a new energy to the training field. The sky was clear, and the fresh morning air seemed to give strength to all the Roman knights, who gathered once again under Marco's command. Today, the focus was on weapons, the deadliest extension of their bodies, and the most crucial part of their training as knights. Marco knew that the effectiveness of his knights didn't only depend on their skill in riding and controlling their horses, but also on how they used their weapons. Each knight needed to be able to wield a range of equipment, from long swords to bows and axes, with skill and precision. "Knights, today we'll focus on weapons," Marco began, observing his sharp and attentive men. "Each of you is an extension of our military strength. But for that strength to be complete, you must know how to wield the weapons we carry. Today we'll test everything we have: spears, swords, darts, and even axes and bows." The knights, already accustomed to Marco's discipline, prepared immediately. But Marco knew it wasn't enough to just hand out weapons and expect the knights to know what to do. He wanted more. He wanted the knights to truly feel connected to their weapons, to use them instinctively and in perfect harmony with their movements. First, let's start with the spears, Marco ordered, picking one up and holding it confidently. Throwing spears are powerful, but they require precision. When you throw them, you only have one chance. We can't waste that opportunity. Marco demonstrated the technique, throwing a spear with impressive force, embedding it into the target several meters away. Aulus watched carefully. He, one of Marco's best knights, knew this training was crucial. The spears, in addition to being the cavalry's primary ranged weapon, were also used in close combat, where skill with a spear could determine the outcome of a battle. "Now give it a try," Marco said, signaling to the knights. Quick and precise throws. No rushing, just focus. The precision drills began, with each knight taking turns. Some were better at throwing, while others struggled to hit the targets. Marco, observing each one, began giving tips, correcting posture, hand position, and throw strength. Next, Marco shifted his focus to the long swords, another essential weapon for the cavalry. He drew an imaginary line with the blade, executing a smooth, swift cut, perfect for disarming an opponent without delivering a fatal blow at first strike. "The sword is our closest extension," Marco said seriously as the knights watched. "It needs to be used fluidly, but with control." He then taught them how to position the sword while mounted, how to attack with strength and defense at the same time. He guided them through attacking stances, emphasizing the importance of never losing balance while riding, as an unbalanced knight would be an easy target. The knights, under Marco's watchful eye, began practicing the movements, now more confident with the sword. Each strike was made with more confidence and precision. They were beginning to understand the importance of being a complete knight, someone who could face any adversary, not just with brute strength, but with technique and intelligence. "Now let's move on to the bows and arrows," Marco continued, handing a bow to Aulus. "In certain battlefields, accuracy at a distance can be decisive. You need to learn to use the bow, not just as a support weapon, but also as a strategic attack." Aulus, already accustomed to using different weapons, positioned himself and shot with precision. The arrow cut through the air and struck the target with a satisfying thud. Marco smiled, but he couldn't let the exercise be just a demonstration of skill. All the knights needed to master the bow, because in battle, distances were unpredictable, and the flexibility to attack from afar could be the deciding factor. "Flexibility is what makes our cavalry unique," Marco said with a hint of pride. "We're not just knights with swords and spears. We're versatile warriors, ready to face the enemy in any way." Finally, Marco focused on the heavier weapons like battle axes. Although they weren't as common among the cavalry, the axe was an excellent option when it came to piercing enemy armor. The knights began practicing with the axe, delivering powerful and brutal strikes, the strength of the metal cutting through the air. "The axes are our weapons of destruction," Marco explained, watching the knights practice. "Use them wisely. Don't rush, but strike with strength and determination." As the day went on, Marco watched the knights beginning to master the different weapons with impressive skill. They were no longer just knights, they were complete warriors, ready to face any enemy. Marco was proud. He knew that when the time for real battle came, these men would be more than prepared. They were the strength of Rome, and Rome would never fail. "Excellent work, knights," Marco said at the end of the training, with a satisfied smile. "We're ready for whatever comes next. Let the enemy know that our cavalry is unstoppable." The knights, sweaty and exhausted, but with hearts full of confidence, raised their shields in a sign of unity and loyalty. They knew Rome was with them, and nothing would stop them. The day's training was complete, but Marco knew there was one more critical stage to address. As the sun began to set, painting the sky with golden and red hues, he gathered his knights to talk about an essential part of their equipment, the armor for their horses. Although the knight was the key piece of the Roman cavalry, without a well-trained and protected horse, all the effort would be in vain. Marco knew that the horses were much more than simple mounts. They were partners, warriors in their own right. And to ensure they survived the intense battles and the weight of combat, the armor for the horses was of utmost importance. "Knights, today we'll learn to protect our mounts," Marco began, his voice firm and authoritative, but with a tone of concern. "The horse is our strength, our companion. Without him, we are just men." He looked around, seeing his men attentive. They knew that caring for the horses was as vital as caring for their own lives. Marco continued, pointing to the animals resting in a corner of the field, ready for training. Horse armor is essential in combat, especially when we face enemies who may use spears, arrows, and other ranged weapons. We'll start with light armor, the kind that offers protection without hindering the animal's movement. As the knights gathered around, Marco signaled to the assistants to bring over the armor pieces. The first ones were made of lightweight iron, designed to cover vital areas of the horse's body without adding too much weight. The leather pads and leg protections were custom-made, so the horses could move quickly and with agility. These armors are designed to ensure the horse's safety, but also its speed. A slow horse is useless in battle, so we can't overload it with weight. Marco explained as the knights adjusted the armor on their horses. He knew that balance was key. If the armor was too heavy, the horse would lose agility and endurance, crucial factors for quick maneuvers and effective attacks. Aulus, always attentive, began to dress his horse in the light armor. He carefully adjusted the leg protections and the reinforced leather cloak covering the horse's neck and chest. Aulus's horse, an imposing animal with dark fur, seemed comfortable, its muscles still flexible despite the new weight. Marco watched each of Aulus's movements, paying attention to the details. He knew Aulus's skill with the horse was exemplary, but the precision of the armor fit was just as vital. "Very good, Aulus," Marco said, seeing him adjust the protections with skill. "You've understood the importance of agility. Now, let's put on the heavy armor." Soon, the knights began working with the more robust armor. These were made of iron plates, designed to cover the horse's vital areas such as the torso, head, and thighs. Each piece was carefully positioned to ensure the horse was protected from lethal strikes, without losing all mobility. The headpiece was one of the most intricate, covering the horse's skull while leaving space for its eyes and ears. The heavy armor is used when we know we will face strong and organized enemies. It offers more protection, but it makes the horse less agile. That's why we should only use it when necessary. Marco explained. He approached one of the assistants, observing the armor being placed on one of the older horses, which seemed comfortable with the extra weight. Marco then looked at his knights and spoke with a serious tone. "In battle, horses with heavy armor will be our front line. They will be the first line of attack, absorbing strikes and protecting the lighter units. We need to make sure the horses wearing this armor know how to move well on the battlefield." With a signal from Marco, the knights began a series of exercises, trotting and galloping in their heavy armor. The sound of the hooves hitting the ground, now deeper and more resonant, echoed across the field. The horses, though heavier, moved with impressive strength, adapting to the new weight as if they knew exactly what they needed to do. Marco watched as the horses quickly adjusted. Agility drills were conducted, with the horses making tight turns and responding quickly to the knights' commands. Even with the heavy armor, they still managed to move with surprising dexterity. Marco's confidence grew with every well-executed maneuver. "This is the strength of our cavalry knights," Marco said with an approving smile. "When our horses are well-protected and well-trained, there's no enemy that can stop us." Aulus, now mounted, made a quick turn with his armored horse, feeling like part of a perfectly synchronized machine. He knew that, with the armor, the horse was more than just a mount. It was a fighter as strong as any Roman soldier. Marco, seeing the success of the training, decided to end the exercise, but not before reinforcing an important lesson. Remember, knights, the armors are not just for protection. They are part of our warfare style. Like the weapons in our hands, they reflect our strength and our adaptability. The Roman cavalry is unstoppable, and now we are sure that our horses are as invincible as we are. With Marco's words echoing in their ears, the knights gathered around, their horses protected, ready to face any challenge. They were more prepared than ever to defend Rome, as one unit, an unbeatable force. The intense day of practice with armors and weapons had passed, but there was something else Marco wanted to discuss, something he knew was not just functional, but also a powerful symbol of his knight's status and identity. As the knights settled around the fire, Marco signaled for an assistant to bring a set of ornate masks. They were carefully laid out on a cloak, reflecting the flickering light of the fire. Each one seemed more than just a simple piece of metal, but a true work of art, made to impress and inspire. Knights, these masks are not just ornaments. They are part of our legacy and our strength. Marco began, with an intensity in his eyes that captured everyone's attention. These masks are worn by our elite cavalry. They are symbols of our position, our courage, and above all, of our unity. He picked up one of the masks and held it up in front of the knights. It was an iron mask, carefully crafted with intricate details, lines mimicking leaves and branches, with polished metal eyes that seemed to shine in the firelight. It was heavy, but imposing, reflecting the nobility of the warriors who wore it. These masks are an honor. A knight who wears one of these is not just a soldier. He is a symbol of Rome, of the power and determination of our empire. Marco continued with a deep, respectful voice. But remember, they are more than just status symbols. They have a purpose. The knights watched closely, paying attention to what Marco was saying. For many of them, the masks were something almost mystical. They represented the pinnacle of a knight's career, the recognition of their skills, and the trust placed in them. But there was more behind them, something Marco was now beginning to explain. In combat, the masks make us an indivisible unit. Marco explained. They hide our faces, but they reveal our identity as a whole. When we are in battle, we are no longer just men, but Rome in its purest form. The mask is not just a war ornament. It is a psychological tool. By wearing it, we become more than individual warriors. We become a symbol of terror to the enemy. They no longer see a man, but an unbeatable force. Aulus's gaze sharpened as he listened to Marco's words. He had already heard about the psychological impact of the masks in battle, how they could scare and destabilize the enemy. He knew that wearing the mask wasn't just about aesthetics or tradition. It was a weapon in itself. See how the firelight reflects off the masks. Marco said with a slight smile, pointing to the metal pieces. They create an effect that makes the knight wearing them appear larger and more threatening. When worn in formation, in great numbers, they have the power to create a wall of metal and fire. An imposing sight, impossible to ignore. The enemy will see this and know that the Roman Empire knows no fear. Aulus felt a shiver run through his body as he imagined the scene. Roman knights, with their masks gleaming under the sun or torchlight, advancing as an unstoppable force of destruction. He knew these masks were not just for the battlefield, but also to raise the morale of their troops, making each man feel part of something greater than himself. Marco continued, now focusing on an even deeper point in Roman tradition. There are those who say these masks are only used for ceremonies, for moments of great celebration, or even to intimidate the enemy. But the truth is, in our history, they have always been associated with knights who are more than warriors. They are legends. Each scar, each battle mark visible on one of these masks tells the story of a knight, of his courage, of his journey. Marco's tone softened for a moment. He knew that for the men around him, the fight was real, and the battles weren't just fields of victory and defeat. They were milestones in their lives, filled with pain, sacrifice, and sometimes glory. Yes, knights, a mask like this can bring us fame. It can guarantee a position and honor. Marco concluded, but never forget what it truly means, responsibility. The responsibility to carry the name of Rome with honor. The knights fell silent for a moment, reflecting on Marco's words. Aulus was the first to break the silence. He looked at the mask before him, with a newfound understanding. I understand, Commander. These masks aren't just for protecting or adorning us. They are an extension of our honor and what we represent. Aulus said, his voice firm, his gaze resolute. Marco smiled, pleased with his best knight's response. Exactly. And one day, Aulus, if you prove yourself worthy, you will wear one of these masks with pride. But until then, your focus must remain the same, to be the best knight Rome has ever seen. The fire crackled, illuminating the knights' faces as they all stood and, with a reverent gesture, placed the masks back on the cloak. Although it wasn't the time to wear these pieces of metal, they knew they were preparing for something great. The battlefield would be where they would prove their worth, and perhaps one day they would wear these masks as the definitive symbol of their conquest. When night fell completely, the group dispersed, but in their hearts, the Roman spirit was stronger than ever. The masks represented what Rome had always meant: strength, honor, and a promise of eternal victory. The camp was quiet that night, with Rome's knights resting after a series of grueling training sessions. Marco's last words about the masks still echoed in their minds, but there was one more thing he wanted his men to understand: the great diversity of Roman cavalry. Even in such a vast and powerful empire, the cavalry wasn't limited to just one type of horse or warrior. There was a wide variety of mounted troops, each with its own functions and peculiarities. The next morning, Marco called his knights for a special training session. He knew that each of them needed to understand not only the power of heavy cavalry, but also the versatility of different formations and types of mounted combat. As he gathered them, Marco looked at the horizon, where the first light of day began to rise, reflecting off the shiny armor of his soldiers. Today, knights, we will learn that the strength of Rome is not only in the heavy cavalry you already know, Marco began, his voice full of authority. In our army, we have various types of cavalry. Each has its specific role, and each is essential to ensure our victory. He gestured for the knights to come closer. In the center of the field were grouped several types of horses and knights of different specialties. Marco began to explain, pointing to each group. Here we have the light cavalry, he said, observing a group of knights mounted on more agile and faster horses, with simpler and lighter armor. These knights are the eyes and ears of Rome. They patrol the borders and infiltrate enemy lines. They are fast, stealthy, and agile. Their mission is to strike and vanish before the enemy can react. Aulus, always attentive, watched the light cavalry. He knew that their skill in rapid maneuvers and surprise attacks would be decisive in many battles. Light cavalry didn't have the shock strength of heavy cavalry, but their speed and ability to maneuver through difficult terrain made them indispensable. Next to them, we have the medium cavalry, Marco continued, pointing to another group, armed with spears and larger shields, but still maintaining some mobility. These knights are more robust and flexible. They can engage in close combat or support infantry units. Their role is to adapt to the situation, able to fight on multiple fronts. Marco took a step forward and looked at the knights mounted on heavy horses, fully armored. And here, knights, we have our front line, the heavy cavalry, Marco said with an intensity that demanded attention. These knights are the pillars of our army. They face the enemy head-on, with strength and relentlessness. They are the knights who break enemy lines, creating openings for our troops. Aulus observed the heavy cavalry in action. They were fully covered in armor, and their horses, equally protected, moved with an imposing strength. It was a sight of power that made any enemy think twice before facing Rome head-on. But our cavalry isn't limited to these three types, Marco continued, now pointing to another group of knights carrying bows. Here we have the archer cavalry, mounted on light horses, with the mission of bombarding the enemy from afar. They are our elite shooters. Their speed and precision are their best weapons. The group of archers was constantly moving, shooting arrows at distant targets. They weren't there for direct combat, but to wear down the enemy before they got close enough to strike. Aulus was impressed by the accuracy of the archers, each arrow released with a calculated calmness, hitting its mark with impressive effectiveness. Marco, now with a satisfied look, gathered all the knights before him. The strength of Rome lies in its diversity, he declared, with a proud smile. Each type of cavalry has a crucial role, and all are equally important. Our light cavalry patrols the borders and makes raids. The medium cavalry offers flexibility and support, while the heavy cavalry breaks enemy lines. And the archers, with their precision, ensure that the enemy never approaches without being punished. Aulus, always attentive to the details, understood the depth of the message. He knew that each type of knight had its value, but they all depended on each other to make the Roman army unbeatable. Diversity was their strength. He also understood that to be a true Roman knight, he shouldn't limit himself to what he knew, but always be willing to learn more about different types of combat. Remember, knights, Marco said at the end of the speech, the Roman cavalry is not an isolated unit. We are an interconnected web of forces. When we act together, there is no enemy that can defeat us. The training field seemed to transform into a microcosm of the Roman Empire. Knights of all specialties, united under a single command, ready to defend Rome at any cost. Aulus and the others knew that, alongside their comrades, their chances of victory were more than guaranteed. They were certain. The northern winds blew cold and relentless, bringing with them the sense that dark times were approaching. The Roman Empire, one of the greatest powers of the known world, was beginning to feel the first signs of its decline. The legions were fewer in number, and the vast borders of the empire were becoming increasingly difficult to control. However, there was still something that gave hope to those who wore the armor of Rome, the cavalry. As the empire moved into its final period, the Roman cavalry became one of the last lines of defense. Marco, now an experienced commander, knew that his army depended more than ever on the speed and mobility of its mounted troops. With enemies pressing on the borders and internal revolts becoming more frequent, The cavalry was the only force capable of responding quickly to the threats. During a secret meeting, Marco stood in his command field, looking at a map of the empire. The horizon seemed to narrow more and more. Barbarian hordes had invaded the northern provinces, while internal disputes were weakening the power of Rome. Marco's knights, with their sharpened skills and unbreakable spirit, were once again called for a vital mission: to protect the empire at all costs. "The times are changing, Aulus," Marco said with a grave expression, pointing at the borders on the map. "What's left of our great empire is now surrounded by enemies on all sides. The legions are no longer enough to stop the rising tide. Our only hope is the mobility and strength of our cavalry." Aulus, now a respected veteran, looked at the commander with the same determination he had always had. He knew that the Roman cavalry was not just a military force, but a symbol of Rome's power. Yet, even the greatest warriors were starting to doubt the future of such a vast empire with so many fronts of war. "So, what should we do, Commander?" Aulus asked, the concern clear in his eyes. Marco sighed, looking at the knights gathered around, ready to act. They knew they were on the brink of a decisive moment, a turning point where their actions could determine the future of Roman civilization. "We need to focus on the borders," Marco replied firmly. "Our army can no longer fight on a wide scale like before. We need the speed of our cavalry to patrol, attack, and react before the enemies completely surround us. The empire may fall, Aulus, but the Roman cavalry must not." It was a bitter truth, but Marco was right. The legions, which once formed the backbone of Rome, were now far from their former glory. Roman military power was fragmenting, and the battlefronts were spreading over an expanse that seemed impossible to control. It was the cavalry, now more than ever, that held the key to the empire's defense. Marco's knights, with their heavy armor and imposing steeds, were the last line of defense against the chaos threatening to engulf Rome. They would be the first to face the barbarian hordes attacking from the northern borders, and also the first to try to maintain order within the Roman lands, where internal rebellions were becoming more frequent. As the sun began to set, Marco called a meeting with his officers. He knew that if Rome was to survive what lay ahead, his knights would need to be more united than ever, faster and fiercer. "I won't lie to you, knights," Marco began in a deep, serious voice. "Times are tough. Our enemies are many, and the strength of the empire is no longer the same. However, we still have something that many of them don't: our mobility, our ability to strike quickly and retreat without being seen. Our mission is not to win great battles, but to ensure that the empire, even in its last strength, still has a breath of life." The knights stood in silence. They knew that the future of Rome was at stake, and that their actions in the coming weeks could determine the empire's end or survival. "We will patrol the borders, stop invasions, and protect the last strongholds of the empire," Marco continued. "But remember, we are not just fighting for Rome. We are fighting for our legacy, for what still represents the greatness of this civilization. And even if the empire falls, the courage and honor of our cavalry will live on forever." Aulus looked at the knights around him, their faces resolute and full of determination. He knew it was no longer just about following orders or fighting for victories. It was about fighting for an idea, for an empire that, despite its decay, still carried a living flame in its heart. When night fell, the knights began preparing for what seemed like Rome's final great mission. They knew the empire might fall, but the Roman cavalry would continue fighting until the end, a last bastion against the darkness closing in. After all, Rome would always be remembered not for its walls or temples, but for the warriors who, even in its twilight, continued to fight for it. The war had finally reached its climax. Rome was in decline, and the empire that once ruled with an iron fist was now disintegrating under the weight of its own contradictions. But despite the fall of great walls and armies, something still remained unbreakable: the legacy of the Roman cavalry. Even in the last shadows of the empire, the knights continued defending Rome with the same courage their ancestors had shown in the days of glory. Aulus was now among the few remaining members of the ancient Roman cavalry. The battlefield was calm, but he knew that the peace was only temporary. The Roman army was fragmented, the capital was no longer the great power it once was, and the future seemed uncertain. Yet, something in his heart wouldn't allow him to give up the fight. He thought about what Commander Marco had said before leaving for the north, where Rome would face its final enemies. Even if Rome falls, its spirit will live on, and we, the knights, will be the flame that keeps that spirit burning. Aulus knew that even as the empire crumbled, the example of the Roman knights would persist as a symbol of honor and resistance. The field was covered in mist that morning. It was as though the empire itself was silent, waiting for its farewell. The Roman army, now divided and fewer in number, gathered one last time, not for a great battle, but for a farewell ceremony. Aulus and the other knights were there, no longer with the glow of past victories, but with the same dignity that had always accompanied their ancestors. Commander Marco stood beside Aulus, his expression sad but resolute. The history of Rome, as they knew it, was coming to an end. Yet the Roman knights were not just warriors of an empire. They were part of something greater, something that would be remembered through the ages. "Aulus, our mission is no longer to save Rome," Marco said in a serious voice. "We couldn't stop the empire from falling, but we can ensure that its memory isn't erased. We are the last knights of Rome, and our duty now is to preserve what Rome represented to the world." Aulus nodded silently. He knew that while the Roman legions were being outnumbered by external and internal forces, the legacy of the Roman cavalry couldn't be extinguished. In the years to come, that legacy would survive not only in the memories of the men who had served the empire, but also in the armies that would rise from the ashes of Rome. As the first light of dawn touched the land, Marco raised a sword and pointed it to the sky. The sound of metal echoed, and the knights, in their worn armor, took their place, each mounted on their steed with their eyes fixed on the horizon. They were about to say goodbye to Rome, but not to their honor, courage, and legacy. Even after the fall of the empire, Marco spoke with conviction. The Roman cavalry will live on. In the Byzantine armies, in the medieval warriors, in all who come after us, the soul of Rome will endure, for the spirit of its knights will never be forgotten. Aulus couldn't help but feel a wave of emotion. He wasn't just saying goodbye to Rome, but to an era. The world would change, but the flame of the Roman cavalry, with all its discipline, honor, and bravery, would stay alive. Even if the great battles were behind them, the image of the Roman knights would cross the boundaries of time and become a legend. The knights moved away, one by one, mounting their steeds with skill. The last mission of the Roman knights wasn't to fight on a battlefield, but to ensure that the legacy of ancient Rome would be remembered. As the knights rode off to new horizons, the great cities of Rome fell into ruins, but the example of the Roman cavalry would never be erased. It would persist, echoing through generations, as a reminder of what Rome had been and what its knights had represented. The empire may have fallen, but the spirit of Rome, and of its knights, would continue to live on, not only in the history books but in the souls of the men who, for generations, would fight for the honor and memory of ancient Rome. And so, even with the end of an era, the legacy of the Roman cavalry lives on in every battle, in every story, and in every warrior who fights with honor. The empire may have fallen, but the knights of Rome continue to inspire generations.